record to this computer. It is Monday, August 17th, 2026. And last week I sort of took the week off. Tried to take the week off. It was more of a I did less work. I almost had to work every single day, which was disappointing. However, I had to get a deal through negotiation. So today we are talking about fortune is in the follow-up. It still is in and will always be in the follow-up, right? So let me ask you something. Who have you forgotten? Not because you didn't care, not because they weren't important, but because life got busy. We've all been there, right? One busy week turns into two, a vacation, a closing, a deadline, a family event. And before you know it, the people you intended to call become the people you'll get to later. And here's what I've learned. Success isn't built in one conversation. It's built in the conversation after the conversation, the follow-up, the check-in, the simple message that says, I was thinking about you. This morning, maybe you didn't want to get started either, right? You were tired. Maybe you needed another day off after the weekend. Maybe your mind was telling you not today. But here's the difference between people who reach their goals and people who drift slowly away from them. The successful ones don't wait until they feel like doing the work. They simply begin. One email, one phone call, one follow-up, one relationship strengthened. Because fortunes aren't built in one big moment. They're built on years of showing people they haven't been forgotten. I've got a story about that. I built my business through cold calls. And I reached out when I first started making cold calls. I connected with a gentleman, Mitchell. And I said my spiel. I said, can I stay in touch about real estate? He said, he wasn't very friendly on the call, that's for sure. He said, Tony, hey, most realtors suck at their job, but sure, you can follow up. I said, I appreciate that. And he reiterated it. Most realtors suck at their job. And, at that time I was terrified of the calls. I didn't like making the calls. I hated making them. And I said, I'm gonna make the call regardless. I'm gonna keep following up because he said yes. So over time, I kept following up. Conversations became longer and longer, and until one point, a woman picked up, and I was I didn't know what to do. I was kind of surprised, and I said, I'm sorry, hey, this is Tony Toich with Keller Williams. I'm reaching out, checking with Mitch every quarter, and she's like, I'm sorry to tell you this, Tony. Mitch passed away 2 weeks ago, and at this point, I just wanted to get off the phone, right? This was a sales call, and this woman is grieving, and I don't want to, bother her. So I offered my condolences as best as I could, as quickly as I could. And I said, you take care of yourself. And I got off the phone. And I thought for a second, and I sent her a story because about 2 years prior to that, I reached out to Mitchell one day and I said, Mitchell picked up and he said, Tony, I saw it was you calling and I wanted to pick up the call today because you reminded me of something. Success in sales is not built through one phone call, through one deal, through one transaction. It's built on all the calls and all the follow-ups that lead up to all of the deals. And you reminded me of that today. And I told her he said that to me. Then I told her, I said, and I speak and I teach at events and meetings and classes all over town at different KW offices, and I tell that story. So I said, Mitch's words will continue to live on, even though he's not here, and they will continue to inspire others as they inspired me that day. And she invited me to his funeral, and said I could stay in touch with her. So I continued to stay in touch, and I continued to follow up. And she didn't pick up, but I left the voicemails. So a couple months back, she reached out and said, Tony, I think I'm going to be selling one of our properties in October, and I just wanted to say, hey, keep calling. I've been getting your messages. So it is all about follow up, and every relationship in your business exists somewhere on a timeline, right? Some people are ready today, most aren't. And the question is, who deserves to hear from you today? Simply because you made a commitment to stay in touch. Because every follow up says, I haven't forgot about you, right? And most calls aren't going to lead to a deal, but it's about staying in touch and saying, hey, I do truly care about you. One of the things I tell my clients is I'm here to be a long term resource. And I keep following up my clients every quarter after we closed. Right? Hey, how's the house? Can I help take care of the house? Great. And then we catch up, we talk about life, kids, you know. So there's lots of people that are going to be getting follow-ups from me today because I was sort of off last week, but sort of not. Hey, what conversations have you delayed, right? We all have them. Is there a phone call you have been avoiding? A text you meant to send? A client we keep saying, I will call them tomorrow. So what conversation are you delaying? What opportunity might be waiting on the other side of finally making that call? And that's definitely happened to me. I was intimidated to make a phone call from one of my previous coworkers from a past employer. Hadn't called and called. And finally, after, I don't know, I think a couple of years, I said, good morning, Miss Fati.
Who are
Good
you talking
morning.
to?
I'm talking. I'm going through the call. I'm telling the stories. Um, and today's about fortune is in the follow-up, and I was talking about what conversations have you delayed? Are there any conversations that you've delayed, that you're afraid to make the call? And this is on the business side. I mean, the personal calls we can be afraid to make as well. But I was telling a story about how, with one of the previous coworkers from Bones, as it were, uh, didn't want to call them. I felt like, oh, they probably have someone. And after, a year or two of not making that call, I finally made the call and connected. And I said, can I stay in touch about real estate? And she said, of course you can stay in touch about real estate. I wouldn't think of using anybody else beside you, Tony. And, I've stayed in touch. We connect, probably every year or two at this point. But I know that she has an investment property. Eventually they're going to sell in Brookhaven. So I continue to stay in touch. And, obviously she still has her main home, and that was a call that I was avoiding. And, had I never made that call back then, I probably eventually never would have made it, just would have fallen off my radar and been just someone that, I no longer considered keeping in my database. So is there someone in your world that you've been avoiding calling or you should call?
Um, there's always a lot of people to call.
There's always a lot of people to call. I've seen your CRM.
Thank you for noticing.
And that's professional accountability right there. All right. Yeah, there's always a lot of people to call, right? And if you have a lot of follow-ups to do, it's just checking off one at a time. There will be days, Mondays specifically, when I open up my CRM and I'll see I've got 100 overdue tasks because a bunch of tasks fell on the weekend when I wasn't making those 90-day calls. Um, so if you start checking off one at a time, eventually you'll get there, and it's being proactive. Um, so ultimately, and the subject matter of this is fortune is in the follow up, and it truly is. I am living, breathing example of just a follow up that has earned me the deals, and people saying, Tony, you're persistent. You're going to be my guy when it's time. And I've had more of those conversations than I wish I put a ticker for every time I've had that conversation, because I would say I've had that conversation hundreds of times now. So, I've been trying to focus as much on personal as professional on this call, the second half of the year. So, is there someone in your world that personally deserves to hear from you? Because not every important relationship says, is business, right? Some of the most valuable follow-ups you'll ever make have nothing to do with business. A friend, a parent, a sibling, someone who simply needs to know you're on their mind or they're on your mind. Because success isn't measured in just the businesses you build, right? It's measured in the relationships you keep. So, you can think about it. You don't have to say if there's someone in your personal world that you need to call. We probably all have that person. Um, so before you move on with your day, I want you to think about one person you've been meaning to reach out to, one person you've been meaning to encourage, person you've been meaning to help. Now ask yourself, what's really stopping you? Because follow up isn't about closing deals. It's about building relationships. It's about showing people they matter long before they ever need you. The people who build extraordinary businesses just don't show up when somebody is ready to buy or sell. They show up consistently, quietly, patiently for years. So today, make the call, send the text, write the email, reconnect with someone, not because you expect something today, but because you're building a reputation that lasts for decades. That's what trust looks like. That's what leadership looks like. And that's where the real fortune is found. This is Tony Toich signing off for Motivated Monday. Good morning and good luck.